welcome all to this lecture. Migration, Cardio-metabolic diseases is the title. And I will start presenting actually the classic study of migration medicine, Japanese migrating to the US, and for some to Hawaii, some to California. And in Japan, the cardiometabolic risk is low. So what he found, Michael Marmot, in 1976 was an increasing gradient of morbidity and mortality in cardiovascular diseases. Japan, Hawaii, California. There are some concepts in relation to migration medicine. I don't know if you have heard them. Here's the migrant effect we talk about. Migrants tend to be healthier than people staying in the country of origin. You have to be healthy to migrate. And we saw it in 2015, actually. Salmon bias is another concept. And it was from the US. Latin Americans, when getting old and sick, they moved back to the countries of origin. And this could be a bias, actually, when you're studying in registers. But this has been challenged by a Danish study. So for Sweden, for Nordic countries, it doesn't seem to have such impact. Health literacy, well, it's not restricted to migrants, of course, but it's bad knowledge about the body and health. We mention it in relation to migration medicine. And if we look at migration in general, and actually I would say migrating to highly industrialized countries, increase of weight, the longer you stay, the bigger you get. And this results in increased risk of diabetes, hypertension, and CHD. And the trend in the world nowadays is urbanization in general, moving into the larger cities. And in Sweden, that process took place between 1940s and 1980s. And as urbanization is associated with changing habits, especially physical activity and diet, and mechanization we always talk about. You know, increased use of motorized vehicles and decreased physical activity. And Coca-Colanization is another concept. It's more of fast food, junk food, and sweet beverages. And the development in the world of cardiometabolic diseases, well, there's an uneven development, but it's an increased risk of obesity. We talk about epidemic of obesity and diabetes and also hypertension. But in contrast, decreased risk of CHD. You see, CHD death went down by 22% in the world between 1990 and 2013. The metabolic syndrome, I don't know if you have heard about it, but it includes 5 factors: obesity or abdominal obesity, blood lipid disturbances, and these 2 factors are included, and then disturbed glucose metabolism and also increased blood pressure. And actually, diabetes, pre-diabetes, seems to be more pronounced among individuals from the Middle East and also South Asia. But increased blood pressure, it has been more pronounced among Europeans. I'll come back to that later on. But you can look here, BMI, we have these cutoff points, but it's for Europeans. So if you look in Japan, it's different. What we call overweight in Europeans, it's actually obesity in Japanese. And China is something in between. So BMI is not a general measure for all populations in the world. Well, coronary heart disease is an interesting study from JAMA. You know, the US are in war now and then, and they have been looking at disease soldiers. You see in Korean War, 1950s, 77% had coronary atherosclerosis. Really large. Vietnam War, it was lower, and the last was 8.5%. And these are, of course, young men between 20 and 35 years of age. In Afghanistan, in Iraqi war, the mean age was 26 years. And this goes together with that mortality in cardiovascular diseases has been decreased by 72% since 1968 in the US. And what about Sweden? We say that the mortality has decreased since the 1980s, but actually you can see in women already from the 1960s. And here is the curve for stroke, and here for CHD. And you also see, of course, the difference between men and women. And if we look at educational level and myocardial infarction, you see difference between men and women, but also large differences, especially for men, for educational level, low educational level, much higher than when this is the highest educational level, 3 levels actually. Nowadays we seems to reach a plateau so it's not decreasing any longer. And if we look at cardiovascular risk factors in general, well, I was taught once upon a time that was 3 factors: smoking, hypertension, and blood lipid disturbances. But they were considered only to explain about 50%. In 2003, there were some articles in JAMA, and they added diabetes. We could actually say disturbed glucose metabolism as a factor. And these factors were actually, according to these studies, explaining 80 to 90%. Then you have psychosocial factors or socioeconomic factors, very important, and to some extent they also are mediated by smoking, hypertension, and blood lipid disturbances, of course, dietary habits, and also type 2 diabetes. And why is it that CHD has increased so much in the world? Well, we can look at Sweden as a model, and actually this is a modeling study, and you can see between the years 1986 and 2002, and they estimated that population reductions in major risk factors, they accounted for 55%, and most by lower serum cholesterol and changed dietary habits. You see, 40% they estimated. And then, of course, smoking, lower blood pressure, lower physical inactivity. But of course, negative factors, you know about overweight and obesity and increased diabetes prevalence. And medical therapies on individual level, 36%. Of course, medication, but also therapeutical procedures, you know, acute therapies. I was talking about migration, and what about immigration and coronary heart disease? The first studies were actually, beside the study from Japan and the US, in the UK, that South Asians had a high risk of CHD especially. And in Sweden, we have looked at this, and it's an increased relative risk in many immigrant groups from European countries, but also the Middle East countries. And you know the risk factors. In many groups, smoking is very common. Dietary habits, what about stress and genetic factors? I'll come to that later. Not so easy, I would say. And what about high blood pressure in the world? don't know if you know the picture nowadays. Traditionally, Europe has been the high-risk region, but according to a Lancet article from 2 years ago, of course, hypertension has increased, and in 2015 for men 24 and women 20% around the world, for people above 18 years of age and above. But nowadays the highest prevalence of blood pressure, hypertension, is Central and Eastern Europe, Africa, south of Sahara, and then from the, I prefer to say the Indian subcontinent, but South Asia is called in especially British literature. And blood pressure has decreased in some high-income countries, especially in Western Europe and North America. It's interesting, the blood pressure has always been high in Europe compared to North America. I haven't got any good answer why it is so. You should imagine that it would be a high-risk region, North America. And what about migrants in Europe as a whole? We can see high-risk groups. You recognize these from the earlier picture. Low-risk groups, Middle East. And in the article they mention above all from Muslim countries. In Sweden, there's a lack of studies, but we've actually found the high-risk group was Finnish migrants, and low-risk groups, non-European countries, especially the Middle East group. And you could say that migrants from South Asia and Africa are only some percents of all foreign-born individuals in Sweden. Then I come to diabetes, and that is what I have been most interested in. You see, diabetes prevalence is estimated by WHO in the year 2000. The published is 2004. They estimated that it should be 336 million people, and you can see from Lancet article it was estimated in the year 2014 that, and it's 18 years of age and above, 457 million, so much larger. So we talk about an epidemic of diabetes in the world, but there are large differences between different regions. And actually in northwestern Europe, and Sweden belongs to this, of course, it's small increase, and especially in older individuals. But in the rest of the world, it's a large increase in many other regions. And it will be a great problem, of course, for the healthcare system in Africa, Middle East region, other Asian countries, and Latin America. And diabetes has been known since the Greek, but no, it was the Egyptians who described it first. But the prevalence is very low in Aborigines, or if you say native folks. For instance, New Guinea, South America, Africa. Medium prevalence, here we have Sweden. And high prevalence, I'll come to that, the high prevalence in the world today. South Pacific, Micronesia, is above 25%. And the world record American Samoa is 30 to 35% prevalence of diabetes. But also many Arab populations in the Middle East, especially the oil-rich Gulf states, up to 30%. And also East Indian population in the diaspora, South Africa, Mauritius, Micronesia. And this is the most studied group in the world, Pima Indians in the US. They have up to 40 to 50% of diabetes. It's normal to have diabetes rather than not to having it. And what about migration studies? Tokelau, I don't know if you have heard, small islands northeast of New Zealand, belongs to New Zealand. And then Ethiopians in Israel and Indians in the diaspora, these are classic studies. And you always see this migrating to higher industrialized countries, increasing risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And in Europe, there are studies, I mentioned the UK and South Asians, yes, it was for CHD earlier, now it's for diabetes. And for Turks and Moroccans in the Netherlands. And in Sweden, actually we looked at the Nordic countries and it was published in 2010. But it is reflecting the situation for 2005. And then the diabetes prevalence at that time was around 3%, between 2 and 5%. Nowadays it's around 5% in Sweden, registered diagnosis of diabetes. And the rate of the foreign-born individuals in the Nordic countries then was 3 to 13%. In Sweden, nowadays it's 17%. Finland has always had lower rate. Norway is, I would say, 10 to 12% nowadays. And what did we find? I marked with red what's most important. If you look at European migrants to the Nordic countries, in Sweden, perhaps for people from Finland and former Yugoslavia, non-Europeans, yes, there they have the excess risk, and especially women from the Middle East and South Asia. You look, up to 12 times. And the results, yes, non-European migrants, especially Middle East immigrants, 3 to 4 times increased risk in Sweden, especially for migrant women. And people from South Asia have the highest excess risk. And this is a rather small group in Sweden, but large in Denmark and Norway. And this is the study with the increased risk of 10 times. Ethnic Danish women, 2.8% prevalence, but Pakistani women in Denmark, 28%. 28%. And we are living, of course, in Stockholm County, and the Center of Public Health in 2007, they showed large differences in prevalence. Danderyd, north of Stockholm, the high socioeconomic status, women, you can see, below 1%, men 2%. And well, men have a higher prevalence in Sweden nowadays, in the world nowadays as well. And Rinkeby, where many migrants are living, Swedish-born, it's one small minority among other minorities. Low socioeconomic status. You see, women 10% compared to below 1%, men 7.5% compared to 2% in Danderyd. And this is just to remind what says the Swedish law. It says that everybody has the right to good health, and if you have high needs, you should have priority to health care. This is in practice. This was the situation earlier in primary care. We had the Conservative Party said, no, everybody should have, you should have equal reimbursement. It should not be according to healthcare needs. And how do we explain this with a high diabetes prevalence? Well, environmental factors is estimated that environmental factors actually, if you could have good factors, then 95% of all type 2 diabetes cases could be prevented Theoretically, yes, theoretically, not in practice. Urbanization and mechanization, I mentioned it earlier, and of course increased risk of overweight and obesity. Genetic factors, yeah, I'll come back to that with the hereditary vulnerability. The special factors, I mentioned health illiteracy. Then it's about anthropology. It's about this with round shapes are healthy. Well, it was earlier as in Sweden as well. In the 19th century, the great killer was infectious diseases, especially tuberculosis. It was good to have round shape then. It's not nowadays. Stress, changes in diet and lifestyle. Look at that. Well, you could say that there are both genetic and environmental factors, and actually they cooperate to the increased risk. We know that there's hereditary predisposition among immigrants from the Middle East and South Asia. And we also have socioeconomic factors, I mentioned that earlier, low educational level, low employment level, low income, overweight, abdominal obesity, I mentioned that. Stress, well, what about stress? Doubtful evidence, I would say. It's not easy to study this, and perhaps the concept stress, it should have been strain, actually. Hans Elio, who talked about this concept, he took the wrong word. In a Jewish study, refugees, they were not found to have any excess risk of type 2 diabetes compared to, should we say, ordinary immigrants. I found one Finnish study on traumatic experiences in early life, then they had an increased risk, moderately increased, I would say. And this is about type 1 diabetes. Babies, I don't know if they heard that, all babies in southeastern Sweden. And it's a prospective study, and of course if you look at serious life events, then you find an increased risk, but type 1 diabetes. And of course this couldn't be studied among children with the families, but the whole population, doubtful if you could perform such a study. Hereditary factors. Well, South Asians, compared to other Asian populations, such as Japanese and Chinese, they have a higher prevalence and peak prevalence 10 years earlier, higher degree of insulin resistance, and they seem to have a strong genetic disposition. Middle East, well, it has been studied in Swedish studies. It's early onset, stronger heredity than Swedish-born, and a faster deterioration of the beta cell function. And they, when getting gestational diabetes, pregnant women, of course, this is also more common in this group than in Swedish-born. They are more insulin resistant. Socioeconomic factors. I mentioned Michael Marmot earlier, and he's a nestor in this area. The status syndrome, I prefer to call it, the health gap. The book in Swedish is called Status Syndromet. And the lower the socioeconomic status, the more increased risk of morbidity in general and specifically, and especially cardiometabolic diseases, diabetes, CHD, hypertension, but also other diseases, cancer, mental diseases, drug abuse. And what do we mean with low socioeconomic status? Well, mentioned it earlier, low educational level, low income, low position in a hierarchy, exposed neighborhoods. And actually, Michael Marmot, he started with the Whitehall-2 study of British government officials. Of course, then you can say low educational level, you have a low position in the hierarchy, and low income. And you also have parents with lower educational level and low incomes. So, so to speak, hereditary as well. And explanatory factors to the status syndrome. Low socioeconomic status. You have more problems in life, weaker resources, economy, worse ability to handle new situations. There are biological factors, of course, the lifestyle factors mentioned earlier, but also what we could say psychoneuroendocrinology or immunology. Chronic stress, they have the response of cortisol, they have imbalance in the autonomic nerve system, and also inflammation. Dietary factors. Well, in the world, there's increased intake of refined carbohydrates and fat, and decreased intake of complex carbohydrates, including fibers. But when I was looking at immigrants in Nordic country, I found conflicting results. Couldn't get any evidence of this. But if we look at Middle East immigrants, we could talk about a kind of Mediterranean diet. Of course, very healthy diet, much fruit, vegetables, including legumes, beans, peas, and nuts, but also much sweets, baklava, sugar and coffee. The spoon should be able to stand up in the cup. Much dried food. And also partly adaptation to Western fast food, junk food, colonization. Physical activity. It's not easy to start. We have been studying leisure time physical activity. And it's a Nordic habit to be out in nature. Norwegians don't go på tur, they walk in nature. And actually, car traffic dominates. You don't have to walk if you don't want to. And in some parts of the world, it's high status for the classic car and low status to walk or to cycle. Well, what shall we do about this, especially the diabetes problem? Efforts on different levels, I would say. Society level is very, very important. I think we have to improve the acculturation of foreign-born Swedes and also give better information on the Swedish healthcare system and preventive actions, of course. And the healthcare system where we are working in increased awareness, of course, and improved patient education. We're working with that for many years. I hope it will work out soon. I would say this is from the Swedish MAD. One size fits all. No, it doesn't. If I will summarize this, well, the situation, migration and unhealth, multifactorial. It's not that easy. We couldn't say it's one factor, it's many factors. And many immigrant groups have increased risk of diseases, and actually it varies between immigrant groups and diseases. And partly caused by urbanization. I mean, migration to highly industrialized countries such as Sweden, mechanization, partly changed lifestyle and dietary habits, and also socioeconomic conditions. So that is what I wanted to talk about. So thank you very much for listening.